We are extremely fortunate and very grateful to have Dr. Kendra Read with us this afternoon. Dr. Read is an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine. She is also a clinical psychologist and director of Seattle Children's Hospital's mood and anxiety programs. Kendra has a lot of experience working with children of all ages, working with parents, working with educators, working with other healthcare providers, and she is very in demand to share her experience and expertise. If you go to the Seattle Children's YouTube, you will find many other opportunities to learn from her in formats like this one. So Kendra, thank you for being here. I was looking back and I think it was almost exactly a year ago that you did a presentation for Work Life and the Whole You, and we're really grateful you're a partner and are able to be with our families today. So I'm going to turn it over to you to get started, and we'll look forward to jumping in with Q&A in just a little bit.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. It is such a pleasure to be here. Doing this work is one of the most favorite parts of my job. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And thank you all for taking the time out of what are very, very busy days to be here. Yeah, just thanks a lot. Appreciate it. So today I'm going to be talking about getting back to school, transitioning back to school during the COVID-19 pandemic. I will admit that there's a bit of an anxiety bent to this, and that anxiety is one of the primary things that we're seeing happen for youth going back to school. And I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of emotional reactions about going back to school. And a lot of the core principles of what we'll talk about of how to approach this are shared across those different emotions. So feel free if you have questions about that, as Kathleen mentioned, to pop those questions in the chat if you are wondering about how this applies to other emotional reactions. Okay. So first off, I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose for this talk today. And I wanted to start off our discussion today by with an eye toward equity, because I do want to acknowledge that as we talk about doing something like going back to school, especially if school is in person during a global pandemic, I can't credit myself at all for this phrase, but I've heard it a ton during the past year and a half, and I think it so speaks to the kind of framing ideas that we need to keep in mind as we consider how to apply these strategies to any given family. We are all in the same boat, but in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. So I just wanted to talk about for a minute about how COVID-19 has differentially impacted communities of color and how that applies to mental health care, because this is really going to matter as we think about how to apply these interventions or tips or tricks, I guess you could say, in terms of returning back to school in person. So as I mentioned, COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted communities of color, and we're seeing this in terms of, much higher mortality rates for Latinx and Indigenous and Black people, and seeing death rates skyrocket. And we're seeing that this affects youth too. So we're seeing that Black and Latinx youth are much more likely to be hospitalized than white youth. And they're much more overrepresented. They're significantly overrepresented for COVID-19 complications than for white youth. We're also seeing that COVID-19, aside from just the explicit health impacts, that COVID-19 has disproportionately disrupted the safety and stability of communities of color relative to white communities. So that includes rates of unemployment, ability to pay rent, things like food security, and also just increased safety concerns. So increased stigma, harassment, discrimination, and violence for different groups of people, particularly Asian communities. And we're also seeing that, so I think, the big question is, how does this tie into this discussion of mental health and going back to school? And what we see is that there were pre-existing mental health disparities. So as we talk about the mental health, even if we're not talking about necessarily specific diagnoses, there were pre-existing mental health disparities for communities of color prior to a global pandemic. And then we're seeing that the objective risks for doing things like, say, going to school in person are just different for different communities. So we just need to consider these broader contexts as we think about applying the strategies that we'll talk about going to school. So these things interact with each other, and just noting that BIPOC communities have received fewer resources. They often experience more persistent symptoms of mental health concerns, despite having a similar rate of mental health concerns in their population compared to white populations. So the interaction between the pandemic and pre-existing disparities has really widened the gap and made us really need to pay attention to how to conceptualize and really think critically about how we are effectively championing for support and resources for our BIPOC communities. Okay. And all of this relates to what we consider to be the mental health cascade, especially for youth coming from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're anticipating that there are going to be long-term mental health impacts from these restrictions. So worry about contracting the illness, especially as we do things like go back to school in person, and especially given all the news about the Delta variant and the uncertainty surrounding what that's going to look like. Concerns about what isolation has looked like, what it looks like if we ever have to go back there. The impact on social determinants of health, like I was discussing, in terms of food insecurity, housing insecurity, that sort of thing. And a lot of increased caregiver stress in those domains. And in other domains in general. I think especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I was hearing a lot more from parents in terms of distress before I heard distress from youth. And now we're hearing a lot of that distress come from youth themselves, and parents are still quite distressed. And we're just noting that, as we've gone through the past year and a half, many youth have not had as much access to the typical mental and physical health resources that they would have if they were in school in person or in the community in person, even if there wasn't a global pandemic at play. So I just want to keep all of these things in mind as some framework as we consider how to differentially apply the strategies I'm going to talk about for getting back in the door to school. Okay. As I mentioned, there are a lot of big emotions that might come from that might come up as we think about getting back to school during a global pandemic. All of them are totally valid. If your child or even you is experiencing a big emotion, of course you are. Of course they are. It makes complete sense. And I think, because of the work that I do, I hear about anxiety a ton. So I just wanted to note that anxiety is a totally normal, natural body feeling, right? It's our body's natural alarm system. So it's not something that we're trying to get rid of. It's not something we're trying to cure. And I would argue this about all of our emotional states. None of our emotions are inherently bad, though they sometimes get that rap, right? So we just want to be really mindful that our job is not to get rid of these feelings, not to get rid of ever experiencing anxiety, because that would be dangerous. Because we'd be doing other risky things that would end us, where we'd end up at the hospital instead. So I like to think about anxiety as a fire alarm or smoke alarm in our bodies, just like we have that same system in our homes or our workplaces. It's the alarm that goes off to tell you, like, danger, danger, something is happening here. I need you to pay attention. And a lot of times we're used to, totally evacuating the building when that goes off. So the same thing is true for anxiety. It's your internal system that says, danger, danger, watch out, something bad might be happening. or is happening. And the problem happens, or problematic anxiety occurs when that alarm is going off too much, and when there's no fire, right? So when we're starting to evacuate this metaphorical building, but there's no smoke, essentially. So in that situation, we want to recalibrate the alarm. We're not trying to remove the batteries or like bash it out of the wall. We just need to make that alarm less sensitive. And I want to contrast this with an alarm going off frequently when there is cause for an alarm to go off frequently, right? So as I mentioned, there are different objective risks for different populations where that alarm might be going off, but for a reason. So we just want to be aware of when this body alarm is going off because there is a real fire, or there's really smoke, or when there is no fire or smoke. So I'm going to be speaking more to this problematic anxiety where the alarm is going off, but there's no fire situation, acknowledging that our alarms go off all the time for real reasons too. Okay, so how do we identify problematic anxiety in the middle of a global pandemic? Sometimes that can feel like a tall order. So I just at first wanted to go over the different kind of themes I often see as it comes to anxiety. And with kids, I use this metaphor, and actually with adults too, as you'll see, I use this metaphor of anxiety being like ice cream. So anxiety is like ice cream. There are a ton of different flavors of it. It's pretty common for people to get more than one scoop. It's also common to have just a taster spoon here or there, or a scoop that has kind of melted over time. So it's still kind of there, but it's gotten better. And I don't know if I've taken this metaphor maybe a little too far, but we eat all ice cream the same way, right? So essentially the intervention is the same regardless of the flavor. So I just want to keep that in mind, that we're going to talk about the different flavors of anxiety, but the general principles for what we do about it are shared. So the themes that you might expect, this may not be news to many of you, but a lot of the themes that we're hearing about have to do with health and safety. So a lot of concerns about germs or contamination. This is in the air all the time. It's in the make sure you pull your mask up, make sure you're 6 feet apart or 3 feet apart, make sure you're washing your hands. Have you used Purell? So it's in the air normally as we talk about how to function during a global pandemic. So if you think about a youth that is, predisposed toward being a bit more anxious and have them receive a lot of anxiety related messages, maybe totally appropriately to keep them safe, we're likely to see an escalation of worry. So where this becomes problematic is when they can't focus on other things. It's starting to get in the way of the things that they need to do or the things they want to do. So we might see them overdo the health recommendations. So yeah, many people are wearing 2 masks per the recommendations, but I'd be thinking about some kids are wearing like 10 masks, right? Or they won't do simple things that we would expect would be okay for them to do, like walk outside in their backyard, even though there are no really other people around, or use their own pencil because it's just around where other people were, and they're worried that it somehow became contaminated. So we want to look out for when that, like I said, that anxiety has really overgrown for the situation. We're also seeing a lot of anxiety around separating from primary caregivers or other safety figures. We haven't really had a lot of experience busting out of our bubbles in the past year and a half. Maybe there's kind of that 1 week in June when we felt safe to do that. But since that time, we really haven't had a lot of practice doing it. So it makes sense that we're seeing a lot more difficulty separating and a lot of worry about, what if something bad happens when we're apart from each other. I'm also seeing a lot of, and again, all of these are common themes I typically see. I'm just seeing a lot more of it. Also seeing a lot of worry about anxiety in social situations. So worry that I'm going to do something embarrassing, that I'm going to mess up. It's kind of like, if you took a year and a half off from the gym and you tried to go back to lifting weights or running the same amount that you were before, maybe I'm just feeling super out of practice. Like, do I even know how to talk to people anymore? So I think we're experiencing a lot of that anxiety around those sorts of topics too. Again, totally understandable how we got here. We're seeing a lot of worry about getting good grades, doing well enough, once I'm back in person, facing sort of, the academic rigor of real person school again is going to change from last year. So I'm hearing from, certainly not every youth, but several of them that it felt like a bit more of a forgiving year. And so coming into this year, where it's like, okay, well, we're still in it, or we might be going back in person, a lot of worry that maybe the bar has changed and they might not be able to reach it. And of course, during a global pandemic, everything is uncertain. So a lot of worries about the unknown or uncertainty. Intolerance of uncertainty is quite a theme for the anxiety world, and we're seeing it all the time. And I just want to note that coping with uncertainty is a life skill, right? Because none of us know what's going to happen from one moment to the next. And this is one of the things that has been so hard about 2020 and 2021, that, uncertainty just surprises us at every turn. Um, so that is a big theme that we're seeing. And then just failure, like I'm going to mess up and make a mistake following the safety precautions, or social failures or academic failures. That's just another big theme that we see. And anxiety can look like a lot of things. I think, when we think about anxious kids, we're often, think about the kids that are quiet or wallflowers. And that might be one flavor of anxiety. So we might see that they're avoiding speaking to other people or raising their hand in class, that sort of thing. And anxiety can, as you can imagine, given all the different flavors of it, can look a lot of different ways. So we do often see avoidance. It might not always be about speaking to other people. It might be about avoiding going to school at all, as you see on here, or avoiding, even hearing anything about the news, or avoiding going outside because what if the murder hornets come back, or something like that. It's kind of an outdated reference, but it's still on minds of the youth of today. Um, Avoidance can also be somewhat subtle, so that sometimes that can look like overdoing our work, or asking a lot of reassurance seeking questions for things that they, routinely would know the answers to, because we're avoiding failure or we're avoiding uncertainty. So that's one way that a subtle avoidance can pop up. We also see a lot of body reactions or complaints. So complaints about headaches or stomach aches or shakiness, feeling hot, feeling cold, all, nausea, diarrhea, lots of different things like that. Because, as much as we think about emotions happening in our brain, they are connected to our broader central nervous system. And so we feel emotions throughout our entire bodies. And often youth can confuse these feelings for feelings of being sick. And especially during a global pandemic, we really want to start to be clear and, critical, use some critical thought, I guess, about why might we be experiencing this symptom. Is that, if we think about the symptoms of COVID, it might feel fairly easy to distinguish from anxiety, but sometimes it gets a little tricky, especially when we're really worried about getting COVID. And then we might feel more hot. And does that mean we have a fever? Things like that. So we just want to be aware of the fact that we can feel anxiety throughout our entire bodies in these body reactions. We might also see sleep or eating difficulties. So eating less, avoiding the cafeteria, frequent waking, frequently sleeping with a caregiver rather than sleeping alone like we used to. We might also see more inattention or difficulty in school performance. And as the fight or flight system might imply, we also see angry outbursts because some systems default to that fight response rather than the avoidance flight response. So that is certainly a piece of what we see when kids experience anxiety. So what do we do about it? Well, one big area, something you all can do as caregivers, is to talk it out with your kids. And here are some tips about how to successfully do that more so. One is just to validate how they're feeling, knowing that all emotions are okay. I'm going to sound like I'm certainly a psychologist when I say this, but all feelings are okay. Not all behaviors are, right? So that's where we want to draw the distinction. But all feelings are okay. It's totally okay to feel anxious, worried, sad, angry, frustrated, calm, happy, excited, all of it. Any of those emotions are totally valid as it comes back to going to school. And our job is as caregivers is just to validate that, to say, you're worried. I hear you. You're excited. That's great. I hear you. Um, it seems like you're feeling sad or angry or scared. And I use the it seems like stem of a statement when youth aren't really naming that for us, and we're maybe presuming based off of what their actions are in a situation, especially if they're not really willing to jump into that conversation independently, like they're not willing to initiate it. We might make some observations like, it seems like you're feeling really angry. It seems like you're feeling really scared in this situation. And that can be an observation that you just kind of let hang in the air and you move on and say, like, that's okay. Seems like you're feeling really scared right now. I get it. And this is also an opportunity where you can tie those physical experiences to those emotions, especially if you're concerned that they might start to confuse that emotion, those physical symptoms of an emotion, with being sick. So if we can say, like, that seems like a really big stomach ache. That happens a lot sometimes when we feel nervous. It seems like you're pretty nervous about going to school. I would also encourage having calm, open conversations about what's happening with COVID and school in your home. So in these moments, you might have a lot of emotions about and thoughts about what's happening yourself. That would not be unexpected. You have an opportunity here to model coping with these emotions. And I want to emphasize that that's really different from modeling mastery over them. So that's saying something like, I'm noticing that I am feeling pretty nervous about, you know, school starting next week and all this news that we're hearing about the Delta variant. And I'm also remembering that we don't have all the information yet, maybe from the school, about what their safety precautions are. So I should probably, let's make a plan to find out what those are before we make any decisions. And that is an example of acknowledging and validating that feeling and talking through some adaptive steps. So we're not like, prematurely coming to a decision based purely on anxiety without some more objective fact in that situation. But what you're not doing in that situation is saying, like, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. I don't feel anxious. You don't have to feel anxious either. You don't have to feel scared. You don't have to feel angry. We want to make all those feelings okay. And we don't want to send the message that we never experience that stuff, because then our kids are just going to feel alienated. We also in these conversations want to make sure that we're not just like providing blanket reassurance all the time of like, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. That is our knee-jerk reaction all the time as parents. And it's not always helpful, right? Because in those moments, we might be totally ignoring what our kids are worried about, and not giving enough airtime to really hearing what their concerns are. But we also don't always know for sure that it's going to be fine. Like, I can't tell the future to promise that specifically. So instead, we want to encourage them to proceed with honesty and conversation and some validation, right? And I say proceed, meaning, staying in the situation despite anxiety, if that is safe, if that is if you've observed the objective risks for your situation and your family, and this is what you're saying, like, it is safe for us to move forward with school given these objective risks, right? In these conversations, you also have an opportunity to name the emotion when you see it, name anxiety. I have kids name anxiety all the time, and they name it all sorts of different things. So they might name it after, villains in books or movies. Sometimes they name it after a teacher they have not loved. Would not recommend that they name it after a sibling. That has not gone well. But really recommend that they name it so you can be a team against this problem, instead of it feeling like the caregiver against like the kid who's really identified with their emotion, like not seeing it as separate from themselves. And in those conversations, you can help them become critical consumers of their own thoughts. So, like, how true is this thought that, like, you're going to go to school one day and you're definitely going to, like, totally bomb socially and everybody's going to hate you? How true is that? How helpful is that for you to get in the door? What are more true or helpful thoughts that you can hang on to in this situation? So just some tips about how to talk through these situations with your your kids. And most importantly, as it comes to anxiety specifically, though I would say this is a place where we can think about broader applications to other emotions, we want to practice doing the thing is that is hard. We want to practice facing our fears. In the anxiety world, per cognitive behavioral therapy, this is called exposures. And when it comes to anxiety disorders and the most evidence based intervention that we have, CBT, exposures are the key ingredient. That's the most important thing. That is the agent of change. And often this involves parents or caregivers facing their own fears too, whether that's the fear of our kids being distressed or the fear that they're facing in that situation altogether. And this is a really important other place to call out. Like, this is a place to really evaluate what are the objective risks in the situation, because we are talking about a global pandemic. And yes, I'm not a medical doctor. I can't like weigh in about what you should or should not do in this situation per your family's medical history or something like that. But this is a place to pay more attention to like the objective fact. Where am I making a decision based on the objective fact? And where is anxiety itself driving my decision making? And that when anxiety is driving the boat, that is the place where I want some intervention, because the more we listen to anxiety and make decisions based off of it, the more anxiety sticks around and continues to call the shots. So to, you know, get anxiety out of the driver's seat, we have to practice doing the hard thing. We have to practice facing our fears. And as it comes to this conversation, this often has a lot to do with going to school, practicing talking to other people. And so we're generally changing our cycle from one of avoidance, where we encounter a feared situation, experience anxiety, escape. Adults in the situation are like, okay, that's fine, we'll rescue or allow the escape. Everybody feels better because like we're not built to tolerate our kids feeling anxious or in distress. And then turns out we've reinforced that avoidance. So that's the thing that's more likely to happen again, because we've taught ourselves, I can't do it, it's too hard, even though that may not be true or helpful, because we have to continue in that situation. So again, instead we want to change the cycle to one of approach where kid encounters a feared situation. They make a step toward facing that fear, right? Despite anxiety. And so they're definitely going to experience anxiety. They're going to practice taking a step anyway. Adults facilitate the taking of the step forward, the facing of the fear, even though we might feel pretty anxious about it too. And then the thing is that over time, anxiety lowers because we've reinforced bravery in that moment and we've allowed for new learning to say, hey, actually, maybe I'm more capable in this situation than I've given myself credit for. Maybe I actually can tolerate this difficult emotion in doing hard things. So that's kind of the general idea of what we're practicing. And so as caregivers, I just want to note that this is hard for us to do. We're not built to tolerate our kids in distress. And so this is just a point where we might have fallen into a trap of allowing avoidance or facilitating that in the past. And this is a place where we want to practice doing something differently. So what do we do? How do kids face their fears? And I will say that this totally depends on what their fear or worry is. So here are just a few ideas to give you a sense. When it comes to just, straight up school avoidance, sometimes we're practicing just going up to the school building. We've been calling it a dry run for day one, right? So we're putting on our backpack, we're eating breakfast, the whole morning routine. We're getting in the car, we're driving to school, and we're walking up the steps to the front door until we get there. Probably can't go in because COVID and, rules, all that. But we can kind of take it as far as we're allowed to take it. Um, so then when the first day of school comes, we've already had some practice and some success getting to the door. So it feels less new. And we've had some recent learning where, hey, actually, I could probably do this. The same sort of idea applies to practicing getting answers wrong. If we're really worried that we're going to mess up, man, I've probably messed up like 7 times in this presentation alone. So it is a human thing to make mistakes, and we want to have our kids practice getting answers wrong. I will say I do often have parents really feel uncomfortable with this one, especially if they're getting answers wrong in class or on homework. And here's a place to really be aware of and challenge some of the anxious thoughts and beliefs that come up for you as a caregiver around like, what's really going to matter if they get this answer wrong? How much might I be contributing to this pattern of catastrophizing the worry? We might need to practice talking to other people or ordering for ourselves by like saying hi to some neighbors or going through, some drive-throughs to practice ordering, whatever feels, given the social nature of this sort of exposure, whatever feels safe for your environment. And we can get kind of creative with this. I've used a lot of phone calls. It's amazing how little practice kids these days have had with making a phone call. Just a different generation. So making phone calls or sending video messages or different things like that. So we can get creative with it if we're not feeling like it's safe to be one-on-one, like in person for whatever reason. And sometimes kids have just had to practice wearing masks around other people or looking at other people wearing masks. And your job in these moments as a caregiver is to support them. So, what does that really mean? So, I draw a lot from Ellie Leibowitz's work. He's a fantastic psychologist who works with the Yale Child Study Center. And he has this equation where support for child anxiety, but I would argue this is true regardless of anxiety. It's more, true across emotional concerns. So true support looks at like the combination of validation and confidence. So I know this is hard and I know you can do it. Where I see caregivers get stuck is where they focus just on one area or the other, like, ooh, this is hard, and they kind of get stuck in that area, or the you can do it, come on, get in there, which is also not so helpful. So we really need the combination of both of those things. This is hard. You feel anxious right now, and I know you can do this. You feel angry right now, and I know you can take a step forward. As caregivers, it's important to remember that we set the tone. So, how we talk about stuff going on, how we talk about the mask mandate, how we talk about the other safety precautions at home, how we talk about, you know, all the news, how we talk about it all matters because that's what's going to set the tone for our children as they walk into a very real situation like going back to school and following safety precautions and engaging in their academic world with other people. So, what you model with your own behavior is key. And in addition to how you talk about it, um, I often think about parents as being the mirror for how their child perceives danger in the world and how they perceive how kids perceive their own ability to cope. Kind of like if you gave your kid like a new dish to eat, and as they took their first bite, you went, "Ooh," they feel like, what are you giving me? What's in here? Right? So we really want to be mindful of not only the words that we say, but also our body language. And just hard because if this is something that's been anxiety provoking for your kid for a while, our kids kind of train our brains too. So we might be experiencing some emotions in that moment. And we want to be mindful of like, "Whew, I'm feeling pretty anxious. I'm going to, be aware of like not contributing to that by like over exaggerated, body language cues of like, this is scary. This is hard. You can't do it." And that's a lot of pressure. So the goal of this is not to like put all this pressure on you to like, because for any reason. And I do want to say that to put another plug out there for taking care of yourself first, because all of this is going to feel insurmountable unless we can give you some time as the caregiver to take a break and even go through some of these steps for yourself. How am I thinking about this? What are some helpful ways I can talk about it? How can I validate my own emotions about this rather than say, like, I can't feel this way. I can't feel anxious. That's not fair either because you are a human in this world. And of course, you feel anxious about it. So, taking care of yourself is going to be incredibly important for any of these steps. And as anybody faces any steps toward facing fears, um, or doing whatever it's hard for any emotion, whether it's anxiety or anger or depression, taking a step forward and doing the thing that's hard, we want to reinforce that through praise and rewards. And I just want to say, like, we need to personalize this to your kids. So you are the experts in your kids, much more than I am. You've been with them all this time. So how you praise them is just you. You probably know best how to do that more than I do. You know, how I praise my 6-month-old or 2.5-year-old is not how you're going to praise your 16-year-old going like, yay, amazing, you did so great. Most teenagers would be like, get out of here. Stop talking to me with that. I don't want to be a part of this. So we just need to think about, like, oh, awesome. That was so great. I'm really proud of you for that. Or sometimes it's even nonverbal, the way that we praise our teenagers, depending on how they are. We also can think about rewards. So earning privileges, earning extra time to do something, getting out of a chore, ordering dinner, ordering a movie, stuff, earning points towards stuff that they would like that they've been asking for, maybe. We can tie this to taking steps of facing fears or doing the hard thing. Because the behavior that you pay attention to, that's the thing that's going to happen again. And so we just want to use that power for good. And then when it comes to school, a lot of times what we see is this tendency toward accommodation. So accommodation is this good word, bad word, right? So as it comes to schools, accommodation has been this good word, right? Like, how can we accommodate your child and their learning needs? How can we make changes to the environment so that they can learn the best? When it comes to anxiety, accommodation is really not a good word. So accommodation is the thing that we're asking you not to do. Because if we accommodate anxiety and we make changes to the environment, listening to anxiety, doing what anxiety wants, that's going to keep anxiety around. And anxiety is really a changeable concern. And I tend to see that accommodation is kind of formalized in 504 plans or IEPs in the form of like extra time, or, don't call on the student or allow them to avoid gym class. If those decisions are made because of anxiety, then we're in trouble, because then that's going to prevent us from or this youth from having opportunities to engage in new learning, toward learning that they can do it, learning that they can tolerate anxiety in these situations. There are also a couple of strategies that I often see formalized in these plans that are not bad, but they're just not the primary intervention, right? So journaling is an example of that. It's like, that's not bad, that could be fine, but it's not the primary intervention for something like anxiety or depression. Another one that I see a lot are relaxation strategies. And often this is what's kind of focused on the most in the school setting as it comes to anxiety. And to be fair, relaxation strategies were, one of the primary skills that we taught kids in the old manualized anxiety interventions like Coping Cat or other things like that. But recent research has shown us that actually relaxation strategies don't help. Like, they're not like contributing to treatment outcome. They're also sending this confusing message about anxiety, like anxiety is totally normal. It's something we all have, but calm your body down. Is anxiety going up? Let's bring it down, right? So it's confusing because then that inadvertently like makes kids feel like anxious about experiencing an increase in anxiety, which is going to happen anyway, and then their anxiety is going to increase even more. We also have seen some recent research in the last couple of years that including relaxation strategies and interventions for anxiety gets in the way of treatment. So it actually makes treatment go longer or makes treatment not so effective for youth. So just something to think about. Instead, we want to build mindfulness over that experience and teach kids to ride the wave of anxiety, knowing that what goes up is going to come down, and we don't have to force it down. We don't have to change it. Like, have you ever tried to push a wave back in the ocean? Like, you're just going to get knocked down, but you can ride that wave into shore, right? So that's the metaphor that I often use with kids. But in schools, regardless, I would really encourage trying to build some partnership between parents, teachers, or other specialists that might be involved as you think about where the sticking points might be in transitioning back to school. So one thing that I've been hearing a lot is some concern that youth are going to start to refuse going to school. So some things to keep in mind if you're thinking that might be the case for your child is to go into the school year with some clear attendance goals in mind, and listing out some steps between where we're starting and where we need to end up, which is like butt in chair in the classroom, right? This is where I'd pull in some partnership with the school, that last bullet point, to say, how can you help us get from the parking lot where we're getting stuck, for example, to the classroom? Maybe there's some interim, landmarks, physical places in the school where we can like land for a bit of time before we get to the classroom. So I've had kids, come in, get in the door and like hang in the conference room for 10 minutes. And then, they hang in this chair outside the classroom for 10 minutes, and then they get in at the next break and they come into the classroom. So we can take some steps to get there. There might even be people who can come support you in getting your kid into the school. But what are those clear steps? How can we get there? How can we get out of bed to get to butt and chair in the classroom? And we want to be really clear about what happens if you make it. What do you earn? What are the rewards? And what happens if you don't? So typically I have families, during the school hours, not allow things like TV or video games or the other fun stuff, because then that would accidentally reward us for staying home. And we want to have really clear criteria for what sick days are. And given the pandemic, we're going to have pretty clear sick day rules as it is. So I could use those and just make sure that you as a family know, how are we going to measure the fever? What are we going to, the school's going to say a fever above this, you can't come. We're going to take a temperature. It's not, we're not just going to go off of like maybe feeling kind of hot, because we know that anxiety can influence that, for example. And then throughout all of this, again, using your attention wisely to increase attention for brave behavior, for doing the hard thing, and decreasing attention for the anxious behaviors. And I just wanted to include this school to home note, which is an example of how you can work with a school to set some specific goals around whatever the hard thing is. Sometimes it's just around work completion. Sometimes it's around, walking in independently or speaking. Sometimes it's about answering a question incorrectly, like I mentioned. There are all sorts of goals depending on what's hard for your kid. And we can use a note like this to set goals collaboratively with the teacher or somebody else at school, so they can kind of keep track of how many times they observed this behavior toward a goal across the day. Pop that in a backpack or email it to a parent. And then you at home can reinforce your kid meeting those goals every day through a point system or whatever system that you might have in place that would be meaningful to your child. So I like to use these a lot, and schools are often used to using a plan like this, more so probably for disruptive behaviors. So like staying in your chair or raising your hand to answer a question, things like that. But we can totally use this for other behavioral goals that are more geared toward anxiety or something like that. So I think this is a great tool to use if you are experiencing difficulty with any part of the transition of the school year. Okay, just a minute or two over. Now I'm happy to take some questions.
Oh my gosh, Kendra, thank you so much for fitting so much in such a short period of time and in such an engaging way. Incredibly valuable. And we already have some questions in the chat. Okay. No surprise. The first is, What if telling your kids about the dangers and concerns about COVID increases their anxiety? Should you limit information access to your kids?
Oh, that's a good one. So I don't think that I would want to avoid all information. So I don't think that's a good idea because your kids are going to exist in the world with other people and where they're going to hear this information somewhere. And I would rather have them be able to have an open conversation with you as a primary caregiver than to hear, bits of maybe even distorted information from their peers, depending on their age. And I would expect it to increase their anxiety. It increases my anxiety to hear about some of this stuff, right? So I think that's normal. And I just want to acknowledge that anxiety in and of itself is not dangerous. It's that problematic anxiety where it's starting to interfere, that where we start to see that become more debilitating, more disabling.
Thank you.
So yeah, I hope that helps.
I am going to trust the person who asked the question to ask for more details if they need by using the chat. And I am going to move us on to the next question
Sure.
as well. What if your kid isn't worried about going back to school? So they're not afraid about that or wearing masks, being separated, but they're mad just that things aren't all going back to normal. And again, I think we can insert what if your kid or your partner or your coworker, but we're talking about children. So please help us out.
Totally. Yes. So, first of all, as I mentioned at the beginning, any emotional reaction to the situation is totally understandable. So, of course, I could totally see lots of kids, adults, anyone being angry that things that they either have to go back in the first place or that things aren't going to be totally normal. So, I just want to first validate that with them. And really think about, like, are there any behavioral targets for things that we need to practice? So maybe it's practicing tolerating wearing the mask because they're pissed that they have to wear that when they go to school, for example. Maybe it's that they have to practice doing work in the classroom again because they're angry that they have to do that. But I would just validate that and say, like, yeah, it makes total sense to me. I think the more that we try to say, like, yeah, but it's fine, is when we start to get into the invalidating world where they start to like really dig in their heels and like, no, I need you to know how mad I am. So that's a place that I would start. And again, just with that overarching, let's practice doing the hard thing that we need to do in order to do what we need to do or want to do.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions about sleep. So someone asked, do you have advice for how to approach facing the fears when what your kids are doing is being unable to sleep on their own? And this person has two children, ages 10 and 7, that used to sleep on their own. And now they're ending up in the parents' bed or next to their bed every night.
Yeah. So there are a lot of fears and worries that can contribute to difficulty sleeping. So super common. So I'd want to understand more what those worries are that are contributing, so that we can do some exposures that maybe target those head on, whether that's about COVID or whether that's about something else. And then I really just am really explicitly setting goals of, maybe practicing being in rooms independently in the dark. We practice bedtime before bedtime, like even during the daytime sometimes. So to kind of rehearse going to bed, we set some rewards for staying in bed for longer and longer periods of time. And then we get to a point where we as parents really need to commit to walking them back to their rooms over and over again so that they can practice, really hanging in their room. And I really, for bedtime exposures, I really like there to be like a fun morning reward if they've hit their goal, right? So, like a really special cereal that you never buy, but they get to have when they've made their goal in the morning. So it's a bit of an incentive where when we're all tired, it doesn't feel like there's really anything in it for me to face this fear.
Thank you. That is such a hard situation. Thank you for the really concrete ideas.
Sure.
What about sleepwalking? Can anxiety show up as sleepwalking in kids?
Yeah, it's funny, like some kids are a little bit more prone to sleepwalking, and I not being a specific sleep doctor, I'm sure like my colleagues would have a lot to say about sleepwalking in general. When it comes to sleepwalking, I think sometimes we see that that's correlated with stress or anxiety. And in those moments, we first just want to make sure that everybody is safe. Um, and then we want to address like the things that are anxiety provoking. So by doing exposures and having them help have those new learning opportunities that will long term reduce that stress or anxiety for them. But during the actual sleepwalking event or at night, we just mostly want to think about safety so that we can keep them safe and kind of move them back to a safe area.
Great. And we have a question about the littles, about the preschool set. They rely on faces for a lot of social cues. And of course, masks inhibit that nonverbal communication and facial expression, which this parent thinks results in some anxiety because there's uncertainty in the situation. How can a parent help ease that without helping the child avoid the situation?
That is such a good question. I actually think about that a lot as somebody I have a 6-month-old and a 2.5-year-old. And so my 6-month-old has only ever been in daycare with providers who wear masks. So I think about that a lot. Um, and so, in those moments, I can just, even for preschoolers, we can use we can adapt our language to say, like, it's hard to know what our teacher is really meaning when we can't see their whole face. That can sometimes make it scary. Um, and know that your kid is getting a lot of other, full facial cue experiences in other situations. But you can put on masks and practice, like even at home, just like different facial expressions, and your kid can do this, and they can, try to approximate what the situation is that's happening at school, or the way that the teacher might say something in some situation that might be anxiety provoking, so that they can practice tolerating that ambiguity, the not knowing, like, what does she really mean by that? So that we could see, like, are we worried that we're getting in trouble? Is that it? Maybe we need to do some exposures about getting in trouble. I have kids practice getting in trouble all the time, surprisingly. So I think that's what I would do, is I'd practice wearing the mask, making different facial expressions, just like with, from here up, to see like what is particularly tough about that situation, and then set some brave goals for being there, even though we feel nervous about it.
Mhm. Great. I think we have time for one more question. There's nothing new in the chat, so I'm going to give a second for something to come up. And while people are thinking, Kendra, I loved what you highlighted about caregivers taking good care of themselves. And I think whether it's your experience as a mom of two littles or all of your work with parents, I think it is really, it is so hard to do that. And I guess
Yeah.
if you have, any words of wisdom or any tips or tricks that you've seen help parents or caregivers give themselves permission to do that, or any creative way that any tool you want to share, I'd love to give you a moment to talk.
Sure. I think from what I see, most of the time caregivers really just need that permission to take that time out for themselves, and to do that regularly as an important tool for the entire family. Because often we feel really selfish that, like, I have to keep doing stuff, I have this long list, everything's added to it, and I have to really help my kids. But really saying, like, actually, I need to carve out this time every day for me. Nothing can get in the way of this, so that I can then do my job the rest of the time, whether that's as a parent or whatever your role might be. I think that is the thing. And then what you do in that time varies from person to person, because I think a lot of people really love to do mindfulness exercises. That's not my jam. I don't love that. That doesn't help me personally. So I think it's just about then using that time for some trial and error about, like, what would really help you take some time, so that you can either have a break, so that you can have time to sort through your thoughts about what's going on, so that you can, think through, like, how you want to proceed with a situation. Just giving yourself some space where it's uninterrupted and just for you. That permission, I I have no authority over anyone else's life but my own, but I, as much as I can, want to, grant that for all of you, because it is so critical.
Great. Thank you. There's been a few questions in the chat about whether this recording is going to be available to share with friends and family who aren't a part of the UW. And yes, it'll be on the Whole Use YouTube channel, so you can share it more broadly. And a few of you have asked if there will be other resources, and we will absolutely include some links to other anxiety resources for children when we send out the link to you next week. I want to thank you all for being here and giving yourself permission to take care of yourself by empowering yourself as a parent and joining this afternoon. Thank you for that. I will also remind everyone here that our wonderful partners at the Whole U, UW Work Life, we have a lot of resources available online that we push out that are anywhere from 5 to 10 or 15 minutes to kind of help you find what might be your space to take good care of you, so that you're doing the incredibly challenging and important work that Kendra has helped us understand today. So you will be receiving an evaluation for today, and we invite your suggestions for future topics and ways to improve our approach to ones like we covered this afternoon. And with that, we are going to let you free to enjoy whatever sun is left or to turn back to your to-do list, and wish you all the best. Thank you so much, Kendra.
My pleasure. Thank you all.